The village was quiet now, its songs and laughter replaced by the heavy silence of loss. A beak stood at the edge of the clearing, her fingers clutching the leather pouch her mother had given her. Inside were dried herbs, seeds, and a small, carved amulet, a symbol of their ancestors' strength. She felt the weight of it pressing against her palm, as if her mother's voice was urging her forward. She looked up at the great baobab tree, its branches stretching like arms toward the heavens. The tree had stood there for generations, watching over the village like a silent guardian. A beak had always believed it had a soul. Today, it seemed sad, its leaves swaying gently in the wind, almost as if whispering words of encouragement. She took a deep breath and approached the tree. Beneath its shade, the ground was cool, scattered with fallen leaves. A beak knelt, her knees pressing into the earth, and placed her hands on the tree's massive trunk. It was rough and warm, pulsing with a life she couldn't explain. "They took Ofori," she whispered, her voice breaking, "and so many others. I don't know if I'm strong enough to get them back." The baobab stood still, silent as always, but somehow, being near it made her feel less alone. She remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell her under this tree. The tales of warriors who fought against impossible odds, of ancestors who refused to be broken. She clenched her fists. "I have to try," she said firmly. A beak's resolve was solid, but she knew she couldn't do it alone. That's why she found herself at Kwami's hut later that afternoon. Kwami was a few years older than her, a hunter with sharp eyes and steady hands. He was quiet, but everyone in the village knew he could track anything, even a shadow through the forest. Kwami sat sharpening his spear when a beak arrived. He looked up, his dark eyes narrowing. "You're leaving?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," a beak replied. "I'm going after Ofori and the others. I need your help." Kwami was silent for a moment. Then he stood, towering over her. "Do you even know what you're asking?" he said. His voice was low, steady. "The slavers are armed. They have horses, guns. What do you have?" A beak lifted her chin. "I have this." She held up her pouch of herbs. "And I have you." For the first time in a long while, Kwami laughed, though it was short and bitter. "Herbs won't stop bullets." "No, but they can put a guard to sleep or make a man sick," a beak shot back. "I've been studying them all my life, and you're the best tracker we have. Together, we can do this." Kwami stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed and slung his spear over his shoulder. "You're stubborn, a beak, just like your grandmother." A beak smiled faintly. "Does that mean you're coming? Do I have a choice?" Before they left, a beak insisted on visiting the baobab tree one last time. Kwami followed reluctantly, muttering under his breath about wasting time. But a beak ignored him. She stood beneath the tree and knelt again, placing her pouch at its base. "We're going now," she whispered. "Watch over us. Watch over the village." Kwami leaned against the tree, his arms crossed. "Talking to trees won't make this easier." A beak shot him a look. "The baobab has stood through storms and droughts. Its roots are deep, and its branches are wide. It's seen everything. It reminds me that we can endure too." Kwami raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Instead, he scanned the horizon, his sharp eyes looking for signs of danger. A beak stood, brushing the dirt from her hands. "Let's go." The villagers gathered to see them off, their faces a mix of hope and sorrow. A beak's closest friends placed small gifts in her hands: a flask of water, a bundle of dried fruit, a tightly rolled blanket. An elder pressed her hands together, whispering a blessing. "May the spirits guide your steps, child." A beak nodded, trying to hold back tears. She couldn't cry now, not in front of them. She was their hope, and she couldn't afford to show fear. Kwami started walking toward the forest, and a beak followed, her heart pounding. The shadows of the trees swallowed them, and the village disappeared behind them. They walked in silence for a long time, the only sounds coming from the rustling leaves and the crunch of their footsteps. Abik's thoughts raced. She thought about Ofori, about her mother's last words, about the slavers and their camp. What if she wasn't fast enough? What if she wasn't strong enough? Stop, Kwame said suddenly, breaking her thoughts. Abik froze. What is it? Kwame pointed to the ground. Tracks horses. They passed through here recently. Her heart leapt. The slavers. Kwame nodded. We're on the right path, but we'll have to be careful. They're not far ahead. Abik's fear bubbled up again, but she pushed it down. She thought of the baobab, of its roots digging deep into the earth, holding steady against the wind. She took a deep breath and followed Kwame into the shadows. Abik tightened the strap of her bag as she and Kwame stepped into the dense, tangled forest. The morning sun struggled to break through the thick canopy above, leaving the world around them shadowed and dim. The air smelled of damp earth and wildflowers, but the faint, bitter scent of smoke lingered too, a haunting reminder of the slavers' passage. We're close, Kwame said in a low voice, crouching by a broken branch on the path. His sharp eyes scanned the ground. See here? These footprints, they're fresh. Maybe a day ahead of us. Abik nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Her legs ached, and her heart thumped with fear, but her resolve burned brighter than the pain. Somewhere out there, Ofori was being dragged away, his small hands bound, his bright laughter silenced. She had to find him. She had to. Do you think they'll hurt him? She whispered, almost afraid to ask. Her voice wavered like a leaf trembling in the wind. Kwame stood, his face grim. Not yet. They need him alive to sell. But that doesn't mean we have time to waste. The weight of his words pressed down on her like a stone, but she refused to let it crush her. She would save Ofori, no matter what it took. Hours passed as they followed the trail, their progress marked by broken branches. Scraps of cloth snagged on thorns, and the occasional deep groove where heavy carts had rolled through the mud. The forest grew darker as they ventured deeper, the air colder, the silence heavier. Suddenly, Kwame held up a hand, signaling her to stop. Abik froze, her heart hammering. What is it? She whispered. Kwame pointed to a small clearing ahead. There, scattered across the ground, were pieces of rope and splinters of wood. Among them lay a tarnished metal cuff, its chain broken. Someone escaped, he murmured, stepping forward to examine the scene. Abik's chest filled with hope. Could it be Ofori? Kwame shook his head. No, this cuff is too large. It must have been an adult. He knelt, picking up a torn piece of fabric stained with blood. His face darkened. Whoever it was, they didn't get far. Abik's hope flickered like a candle in the wind. We have to hurry, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Before they take Ofori beyond our reach. The forest seemed to press in on them as they continued. The birds no longer sang, and every rustle of leaves made Abik jump. They stopped only briefly to drink from a stream, its cool water a small comfort in their grim journey. As they walked, Kwame began to tell her about his past. His voice was quiet, almost distant, as if he were speaking to himself more than her. Drake took my family when I was your age, he said. My father tried to fight him. They beat him and left him for dead. My mother and sister, they were taken. I never saw them again. Abik felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but what words could ease a pain like that? I promised myself I'd never let anyone else go through that, Kwame continued, his jaw tight. That's why I'm here, to help you. Abik reached out and touched his arm. We'll stop him, Kwame. Together, he gave her a small, sad smile. I hope you're right, Abik. As night fell, the forest grew colder and more menacing. They built a small fire, shielding it with rocks and branches to keep it hidden. The faint glow barely lit their faces as they sat in silence, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. Then, just as Abik began to drift into an uneasy sleep, Kwame nudged her awake. Look, he whispered, pointing through the trees. Abik squinted, her heart pounding. In the distance, faint orange lights flickered, torches. "They're not far," Kwame said, his voice barely audible. "We'll wait until they're asleep, then move closer." Abik nodded, her stomach churning with a mix of fear and determination. She clutched the small pouch of herbs she had prepared earlier, her secret weapon. If the moment came, she would use it. Before dawn, they crept closer to the camp. The smell of smoke and sweat grew stronger, and the sound of muffled cries reached their ears. Abik's heart twisted as she imagined Ofori among the captives, scared and alone. They hid behind a thick bush, peering at the camp. Dozens of captives sat huddled together, their hands and feet bound with heavy chains. Guards stood nearby, laughing and drinking around a fire. Abik scanned the faces of the captives, her breath catching as her eyes landed on a familiar figure. Ofori. He sat hunched beside an older woman, his small frame trembling but his eyes still fierce. "There he is," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "Kwame, we found him." Kwame placed a hand on her shoulder. "Now comes the hard part. Are you ready?" Abik nodded, her grip tightening on the pouch of herbs. "I'm ready,"